The Mongol Empire that dominated the 13th and 14th centuries became the largest land empire ever formed in a single stretch of territory. At its peak, it reached from the coasts of Korea across the steppes and deserts to the frontiers of Hungary. With the exception of India and the far southeastern regions of Asia, it encompassed nearly the entire continent, alongside a wide portion of Eastern Europe. Although the unified empire endured for more than a century, many of its regional divisions continued to survive long after. It was only one among several great nomadic powers that rose from the Eurasian steppe, yet it dwarfed all that came before. Unlike any earlier nomadic confederation, the Mongols succeeded in controlling both the heartland of the Inner Asian grasslands and the major agricultural civilizations around them at the same time. As a result, the empire generated a much richer historical record than earlier steppe powers, for many writers were observing the Mongols from within their territories rather than describing them from afar. Studying this empire, however, presents real difficulties. The historian faces a vast linguistic barrier. The surviving material exists in Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Japanese, Russian, Armenian, Georgian, Latin, and several other languages. No individual can hope to master more than a handful of these. Even if such mastery were possible, complete understanding would still be uncertain. Medieval China, the Islamic world, Christian Europe, and the steppe communities formed separate cultural spheres with different ways of thinking and writing history, each shaped by its own assumptions and interpretive traditions. Scholars have tried two main approaches. One method, common in earlier generations, was to rely largely on secondary studies. Writers working in this style synthesized what experts on China, Persia, or Europe had already produced, supplementing their knowledge with translated sources rather than original texts. When skillfully used, this can lead to valuable results, and some influential works on Mongol history emerged from such synthetic scholarship. The alternative is for a specialist in one region or language to attempt a broader survey, drawing on their first-hand familiarity with at least part of the evidence, and using translations and studies by experts to cover the rest. Modern research tends to favor this route. In practice, a historian must choose to anchor their work either in the Persian or the Chinese tradition, since these two languages preserve the largest and most informative body of material. Complete avoidance of translations is impossible, but it remains essential to remember that translated texts can mislead. It may seem natural to assume that Mongolian itself should be the historian's first tool, yet this is not entirely true. The Mongolian language was not written down in substantial form until the era of Chinggis Khan, and the most important work preserved in Mongolian is a single remarkable narrative known widely as the Secret History. A few other fragments survive, but taken together they are too limited to justify the immense effort required to build a full scholarly foundation on Mongolian alone. Persian and Chinese materials provide a far deeper archive. Both literary traditions were mature long before the Mongols appeared, and the documentation they produced during and after the conquests is extensive. This study, therefore, leans more heavily toward the Persian evidence, partly because it concerns the western half of the empire, and partly because these sources are more accessible for direct reading. Most of the works used here were written during or shortly after the events they describe. No centralized Mongol archive survives, assuming one ever existed. For the Islamic lands in particular, Hardly any organized archival collections remain from before the rise of the Ottoman state. Scattered documents occasionally appear in local collections or inside historical works, and European archives preserve diplomatic letters exchanged with Mongol courts. European travelers also left some of the most perceptive accounts of Mongol territories. Nevertheless, narrative chronicles remain the primary foundation for reconstructing Mongol history. This reliance is both a disadvantage and an advantage. The discovery of full administrative archives from Mongol China or Persia would revolutionize the field, but such a discovery is unlikely. Instead, we must work from what remains. China offers an official dynastic history compiled from annual government records after the fall of the Mongol ruling house. The administrative system of China endured regardless of ruling dynasty, ensuring a continuous habit of recording political affairs year by year. The new Meng regime eventually organized these records into the formal history of the Yuan rulers. Persia, without such bureaucratic tradition, developed its own kind of state historiography during Mongol rule. Some of the most valuable accounts were written by prominent administrators directly involved in government. Their works carry authority, yet they reflect the viewpoints of those close to power and must be read with caution, much as one would interpret a history of the English Reformation written solely by the ministers who directed it. To balance these perspectives, historians compare them with regional histories written outside the Mongol realm or in provinces far from the political center. Local Persian chronicles help shift attention away from the court and toward life in outlying regions. Meanwhile, Japanese, Indian, Egyptian, and European authors, writing from lands the Mongols failed to conquer, provide an external mirror that allows us to test and refine the internal record. The Mongols were largely non-literate before the age of Chinggis Khan, and even in the generations after his rule, they did not become a markedly literary people. As a result, almost all written evidence for the history of the Mongol Empire comes from the pens and brushes of their enemies, their conquered subjects, or neighboring civilizations that were more firmly rooted in written culture. These viewpoints are extremely valuable, yet it is unfortunate that they are almost the only ones available. This is what gives the work known as the Secret History of the Mongols its unique importance. It is the only substantial surviving Mongol narrative about the empire, and the only extended text that lets us see how the Mongols themselves may have understood their past without the filter of conquered peoples or hostile observers. The Secret History has reached us in a curious way. It was originally composed in Mongolian, but the version that survived was not preserved in the alphabet that Chinggis Khan had adopted and adapted from a Uyghur Turkic script. At some point in the 14th century, the text was painstakingly rewritten using Chinese characters purely for their sound values without regard to their meaning, in order to represent Mongolian pronunciation. This phonetic transcription worked surprisingly well and, together with a later abridged version translated into Chinese, is the form in which the work has come down to us. The author or compiler is unknown, and the exact date of composition is also uncertain. The Mongols used a 12-year animal cycle for dating, and the text itself tells us that it was completed in a year of the rat. The narrative runs from the mythical origins of the ruling clan in distant legendary time down to the later years of the reign of Chinggis Khan's son and successor Ogadei, who died in the early 1340s. The section dealing with events after the death of Chinggis in 1227 looks like a later extension, and further additions may have been made afterwards, but the most likely dates for the original completion of the work fall around the late 1220s, or the year just before Ogedei's death. In either case, the secret history offers a contemporary Mongol vision of their own rise to power and of the wider world as they perceived it. Whether it can be treated as a reliable guide to events is a different question. Scholars have disagreed sharply on this point. Some have regarded it as little more than an entertaining collection of tales, or even as a kind of fictionalized historical romance. Many others, however, have used it as their principal source for the life and career of Chinggis Khan. The difficulty lies in its isolation. There is often no way to verify much of what it says. It could be wrong in many details, yet if we simply discard it, we may be throwing away our most detailed and authentic Mongol testimony. One way to test it, at least in general terms, is by comparing it to another Mongol work that once existed but has not survived in its original form, the official chronicle known as the Golden Book, or Altan Detter. This text was kept at the courts of Mongol rulers and was treated as strictly restricted material, closed to outsiders. Nevertheless, parts of its contents can be reconstructed indirectly. When the great Persian statesman and historian Rashid al-Din was commissioned by the Ilkhan Ghazan to write a history of the Mongols, he had to be informed of what the Golden Book contained, and he incorporated a second-hand version of its material into his account of the early empire. In China, a Chinese-language compilation was also produced from the same official tradition. By comparing these two strands of evidence, modern researchers have been able to form a reasonable sense of what the Golden Book probably looked like. When the secret history is set beside this reconstructed material, two things become clear. First, the secret history and the Golden Book are independent of each other, rather than one being a simple copy of the other. Second, although their wording and emphasis differ, they describe broadly the same sequence of events in broadly the same way. There is therefore no convincing reason to treat the secret history as pure invention, unless one is prepared to assume that two quite separate Mongol works both independently fabricated an entire pseudo-history. This does not mean that the secret history should be treated as infallible. It should be handled as serious historical evidence, but not as unquestionable truth. The opening passages are frankly mythic, beginning with the tribal legend that the Mongols descended from a wolf and a doe. How far this early section preserves any faint memory of real events is hard to say. Yet once the narrative moves into the 12th century, it enters a world that we can cross-check with Chinese and other sources. The account of Chinggis Khan's immediate ancestors, the Mongol rulers of that period, is clearly rooted in historical reality, even if some details are uncertain. Most of the book then focuses on Chinggis himself, his childhood, his struggles, and his ascent to dominance within Mongolia. The tone is saga-like, filled with poetic passages and lengthy speeches in direct dialogue. This epic style is no more a reason to reject it as a source than the set-piece orations in classical Greek histories are a reason to discard those works. The overall pattern it gives for Chinggis' rise, from a successful raider with a small following to supreme ruler of the steppe peoples, Mongol and Turkic alike, is entirely plausible. The stages of that rise also make sense. At first, a few personal followers gather around a talented young leader. Then the support of a powerful patron is secured. Eventually, there is a rupture with that patron, followed by a period in which rival clans are defeated one after another and absorbed into the new Mongol military and political structure. The motives that the secret history assigns to Chinggis and to other actors need to be treated more cautiously. The work repeatedly portrays other steppe rulers as treacherous and faithless, driven by envy and bad faith to betray agreements, whereas Chinggis appears as scrupulously loyal, driven to conflict again and again by the perfidy of former allies. One could certainly read the same sequence of events in a different way and see Chinggis as the ruthless opportunist, determined to allow no rival to survive. On this deeper level of intention and character, we may never reach certainty. What we can say is that the narrative offers a coherent Mongol justification of his actions, which is itself a significant historical fact. Whatever doubts historians may entertain about its value for precise political or military chronology, on one matter there is no serious disagreement. As a window onto the everyday world, habits of thought, and religious assumptions of 13th century Mongol society, the secret history is unequaled. On such questions, the testimony of non-Mongol observers must be treated as secondary. Only in this work do we find a sustained attempt by a Mongol author to make sense of the conquests from the inside. Modern readers, looking at maps of the empire, are tempted to imagine that the Mongols worked to a clear, grand design of world conquest, pushing steadily in all directions. Certainly, as their victories accumulated, they came to believe that they possessed a divinely granted mandate to rule the entire world, and ideas drawn from Turkish and Chinese traditions probably reinforced this conviction. Yet the mental world revealed in the secret history is more limited and more revealing. For its author, what really matters is Mongolia itself, the balance of power among the tribes, and the ordering of relations inside the steppe. Beyond that, the region that truly counts is China, above all North China, long the dream prize of steppe conquerors. By contrast, the campaigns in the Islamic lands to the west are recounted briefly and somewhat confusedly, and the great invasion of Russia and Eastern Europe is treated in even more cursory fashion. The only aspect of the Western campaign that seems to interest the author is the quarrel that broke out among some of the Mongol princes serving there. The internal feud among royal kinsmen is described in detail, whereas the fates of Russian princes or the emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire are passed over as minor and peripheral affairs. This hierarchy of interest changed after the empire fragmented into several effectively independent khanats, when Mongol rulers began to seek allies wherever they could find them, including among the previously despised Europeans. But the fundamental assumption that China was the central and most significant prize of conquest remained and is crucial for understanding Mongol policy. However valuable the secret history may be, it ends around 1240 and is limited both in date and in the range of its concerns. Something similar can be said of the Chinese sources. They are rich and indispensable for the history of Mongol rule within China itself, yet the main official work, the dynastic history of the Yuan, is often judged one of the less satisfactory examples of the Chinese dynastic histories. It follows an established pattern, set many centuries earlier. Chinese officials had long experience of dealing with foreign conquerors who took over rule in China, and they had a standardized way of recording their reigns. The Yuan history, compiled under the next dynasty, treats the Mongol rulers primarily as Chinese emperors, placing events firmly within a Chinese framework. A reader could easily forget that China at that period formed part of a vast transcontinental empire. The text pays very little attention to events outside China, except insofar as they touch directly on Chinese affairs, and it has no separate sections on the other Mongol Khanites. The only foreign states granted detailed treatment are those that had already been firmly established as subjects of dynastic histories, such as Japan, Korea, or Burma, which had long-standing tributary or treaty relationships with the Chinese court. Even so, some of the detailed thematic chapters of the Yuan history are of wide significance for understanding Mongol rule in general. Those dealing with economic policy and with the military system, for example, illuminate Mongol practices beyond China. Several of these chapters have been translated and studied in depth, and the introductions and notes supplied by modern scholars are essential, since the chapters themselves are dense and elusive, and would be nearly impossible to interpret correctly without expert guidance. Chinese narrative sources are further enriched by the accounts of several travelers who visited Mongol territories, among them a Taoist monk who journeyed from China to Central Asia to meet Chinggis Khan, and officials sent as envoys by the Southern Song court. Their travel narratives add concrete detail about everyday conditions, administration, and court life. It would be just possible to sketch a rough history of the Mongol Empire without using the secret history or the Chinese sources, although it would be a poor and incomplete account. It is almost impossible, however, to write a serious history of the empire as a whole without the Persian chronicles. This is not because Persia was more important to the Mongols than Mongolia or China, but because the range and scope of some Persian works are unmatched. Part of this may reflect the profound shock that the Mongol invasions inflicted on the Islamic world. Chinese civilization had long experience of dealing with barbarian conquerors from beyond the northern frontiers. The Muslims of Western Asia had never faced anything comparable to the Mongol storm. In classical Islamic thought, the world was divided into two broad zones. One was the abode of Islam, in which Islamic law held ultimate authority, rulers were or should be Muslims, and all inhabitants lived under the sovereignty of the faith. The other was the abode of war, ruled by unbelievers, whose power was assumed to be temporary because the realm of Islam was expected to expand over time through holy war. Treaties with non-Muslim powers were understood as pauses in an advance that would resume. There was no provision in this scheme for the process to go into reverse. Some territories once ruled by Muslims had earlier fallen under Christian control, such as Sicily, parts of Spain, and the Crusader states in Syria, but these losses were limited and reversible. The Mongol onslaught was altogether different. Persia, Iraq, and Syria were overrun and subjected to non-Muslim conquerors who did not even belong to the scriptural tradition that Islam shared with Judaism and Christianity. They could not be regarded as people of a recognized book, however imperfectly understood. For a time, especially around the year 1260, it cannot have been obvious that even Egypt and North Africa would escape the same fate, and the safety of Mecca and Medina must have seemed far from guaranteed. One leading Arab historian of the period described the Mongol invasion as a catastrophe without precedent, a disaster such as the world had never seen, which might not be equaled again before the very end of time. Faced with such a crisis, Muslim historians felt compelled to interpret events, not just narrate them. Why had God permitted such a calamity to befall the community of believers? Some writers, such as a refugee scholar who ended his life in the relative security of the Delhi Sultanate, concluded that the appearance of the Mongols heralded the imminent end of the world, and that their invasion was a sign of the last days. Another great historian, who also wrote in the mid-13th century but spent his career in the service of Mongol rulers, framed the disaster as divine punishment for the sins and failings of the Muslims. At the same time, he pointed to some unexpected benefits that had followed. Islam had spread into new regions as a result of the Mongol conquests, and the existence of a unified empire had opened routes for the circulation of scholars and ideas. He also emphasized that the Mongols had annihilated a Muslim sect he regarded as deeply dangerous and heretical, the Nizari Ismailis, often called the Assassins, whom he considered worse than open unbelievers. It is striking that he chose to end his history with their destruction, presenting this as a kind of moral climax. He wrote in Baghdad only 2 years after the Mongols had sacked the city and killed the last Abbasid caliph. Yet he says nothing about that episode, a silence that can hardly be accidental. As a high-ranking official of the new regime, he had obvious reasons to exercise caution and tact. His work, entitled A Universal History of the World Conqueror Chinggis Khan, attempts to be as comprehensive as possible. He had traveled twice to Mongolia, gathered information at first hand, and consulted a wide range of reports. His narrative covers not only the invasions of the Islamic lands, but also the earlier dynasties whose territories the Mongols absorbed. Central Asian rulers such as the Kara Kitai, the Uyghurs further east, the Khwarezm Shahs in Persia, and the rise of the Nizari Ismailis from their first appearance. He describes the early life of Chinggis Khan, the nomadic way of life of the Mongols, their methods of war, and their customary law. The result is a rich, if somewhat disorganized, encyclopedia of the early Mongol period. Yet even this great work is overshadowed by the achievement of Rashid al-Din, perhaps the most remarkable statesman produced by the Mongol regime in Persia. Trained as a physician and born into a Jewish family before converting to Islam, he entered Mongol service toward the end of the 13th century, just as a major religious shift was taking place. By then, the Mongol rulers in Persia had finally adopted Islam, following the public conversion of the Ilkhan Ghazan soon after his accession. Persia and Iraq were once again part of the abode of Islam. The urgent theological problem that had troubled earlier writers of how to explain Muslim lands falling to non-Muslim conquerors no longer pressed in the same way. There had been earlier Eastern conquerors of Persia, such as the Seljuk Turks, but by the time they took power, they were already Muslims, which made their rule acceptable. The Mongols in Persia now found themselves in a similar situation. Rashid al-Din could therefore treat the Mongol conquest as an accomplished fact, no longer in need of apology. At the same time, as the Mongol rulers and their subjects gradually drew closer together in religion and culture, there arose a different concern that the distinct identity of the Mongols might fade. It was in this context that Ghazan turned to Rashid al-Din and asked him to compose a great historical work that would fix the memory of the Mongol past and give it authoritative form. He did as his patron asked. In the introduction to his great work, he explains that the rise of the Mongols opened a completely new phase in world history, and that such a transformation needed to be set down in writing. He begins with an account and analysis of the Mongol tribes themselves, then moves forward through the story of the empire in roughly chronological order, using the Golden Book, the Altan Debtor, as his main authority for the earliest period. What he produced was first and foremost a history of the Mongols, not an Islamic history with a few Mongol chapters attached. China is given space that comes close to what it deserves in a narrative of the Mongol centuries, and there is extensive material on the great Kubilai, whom the Ilkhans in Persia were proud to recognize as their overlord. Even so, Mongol rule in Persia naturally receives the most detailed treatment, and the narrative reaches its peak in Rashid al-Din's long and intricate account of Ghazan's program of administrative reforms. He reproduces Ghazan's reform edicts in full, and if we were to take his presentation entirely at face value, we would imagine that these changes were sweeping, coherent, and highly successful. In that case, it would be puzzling that the Ilkhanate did not last another 100 years. On the other hand, if government before Ghazan was really as chaotic and corrupt as Rashid's stories suggest, it is hard to see how Mongol power had managed to function at all. The most sensible conclusion is that the formal laws and decrees show us more about the problems that rulers were trying to solve than about actual administrative practice. They tell us what the center wanted to change, not what it actually achieved on the ground. Ghazan died young, like most members of his dynasty, in 1304. He was followed by his brother Oljetu, who kept Rashid al-Din in office as chief minister. Once the Mongol history was finished and could serve as a worthy monument to Ghazan's reign, Oljetu asked Rashid to add a wider survey of all the peoples with whom the Mongols had come into contact. In this way, the Jami al-Tawarik, the compendium of histories, grew into a vast universal history. It came to include narratives of China, India, various Turkic peoples, the Jews, pre-Islamic Iran, the Prophet of Islam, and the Caliphs, and even the Franks and other peoples of Western Europe. Rashid's method was to use whatever written sources he could obtain, and then to supplement these by consulting an informed scholar from the community in question whenever possible. He usually names these informants. The main exception is the section on the Franks, which is perfunctory and reflects the typical lack of curiosity that many Muslim writers of the time showed towards the internal affairs of Latin Christendom. A geographical appendix was also planned, but if it was ever completed, it has not survived. It is above all because of the Jami al-Tawarik that the Persian tradition occupies such a central place in the study of Mongol history. No other people produced anything similar in scale or scope, and even within Persian literature, there is nothing else to match it. Rashid al-Din himself was an exceptionally versatile figure. Besides his historical work, he wrote extensively on Islamic theology, producing writings that are orthodox in outlook rather than strikingly original, perhaps in part to underline his loyalty after his conversion from Judaism. He was a major builder, and the deed of endowment for the quarter he founded in the Ilkhanid capital of Tabriz has come down to us, partly in his own hand. He also composed a large collection of letters, many offering political and ethical advice, although there are problems about how far the texts as we have them are authentic or have been reworked. All this he accomplished while serving as chief minister of a large and demanding empire. It is natural to wonder how he found time for so many projects. One contemporary historian, Kashani, who wrote a chronicle of Oljetu's reign, had a blunt answer. He claimed that he himself was the true author of the Jami al-Tawarik, and that Rashid had merely usurped the credit. Comparison of Kashani's own work with the compendium does not support this allegation. Rashid says that he used to work on his history in the early hours between the morning prayer and sunrise, which would not in itself be enough time to produce so vast a book. The most likely explanation is that he organized a team of assistants, as many senior statesmen and busy scholars have done, and that they gathered materials, copied documents, and drafted sections under his supervision, while he shaped and finalized the overall text. Kashani may well have been one of these collaborators, rather than the sole author he later claimed to be. Because Rashid al-Din looms so large, the equal importance of another Persian historian of the same period, Wasaf, has often been overlooked. The main obstacle is his language. His style is extraordinarily elaborate and difficult, in stark contrast to the relative clarity of Rashid's narrative prose. Stories circulate that when Wasaf read part of his work aloud to Oljetu, the Ilkhan confessed that he could not understand a word of it, and this reaction has probably been shared by every later reader who has attempted the original text. In the late 20th century, an abridgment was published in Tehran, which retells Wasaf's narrative in modern, straightforward Persian. It was intended for native readers, but it has also been a great boon to foreign scholars. In spite of the stylistic barrier, Wasaf is a major source. His chronicle is essentially a history of Mongol Persia, conceived as a continuation of Juvaini's work, but like Juvaini, he ranges far afield. He includes substantial information about China and provides exceptionally detailed and practical material on the province of Fars, where he himself served in the fiscal administration. Where we can reach his evidence, it proves to be rich, independent of Rashid al-Din, and focused on somewhat different themes. Ideally, a modern annotated translation of Wasaf would exist, but as yet no one has undertaken the long and thankless labor required. For now, his work is still less appreciated than it deserves. For scholars who cannot read Persian, access to these materials depends heavily on Russian and other European languages. Editors and translators in the Soviet Union produced critical editions and translations of large parts of the Jami al-Tawarik, and significant sections are available in French and German. Only the portion on the successors of Chinggis Khan has so far appeared in English. As for Wasaf, the only substantial translation remains an old German rendering of the first part of his chronicle by Joseph von Hammer. The corpus of key Persian sources is therefore still only partly accessible in Western languages, although the situation is better than it is for the Chinese material. Among lesser but still valuable Persian writers, one should mention Hamd Allah Mustawfi of Qazwin. Like Kashani, he benefited from the patronage of Rashid al-Din and held high office in the taxation apparatus of the Ilkhanate. He wrote two works of particular interest. The Tarikh-i-Guzida is a concise universal history whose final section gives a brief but useful survey of the Mongol period in Persia. The Nujat al-Kulub is a mixed compilation whose geographical part is especially important. It offers a mass of geographical, historical, and fiscal information about the Ilkhanid domains, and also touches on other regions in a more superficial way. These books are crucial because they were completed in the early and mid-14th century, and thus shed light on the late Ilkhanid era, for which sources are relatively rare. The fiscal data in particular, coming from an official who understood the system from within, are likely to be reasonably trustworthy. Turning from the Islamic world to Europe, the most revealing Western evidence for the Mongols comes from the accounts of travelers who journeyed through their domains. Ordinary European chroniclers paid little attention to events in distant Asia unless Mongol armies appeared suddenly at their own frontiers, as happened in Russia and Eastern Europe between 1237 and 1242. The Chronicle of Novgorod, for example, conveys the shock and bewilderment of a society that scarcely understood who the invaders were, let alone why they had come. The fullest narrative in Latin Christendom is that of Matthew Paris, a monk of St. Albans. He seems to have had access to good information and combines vivid anecdote with serious reporting. His story about the fall in the price of herrings at Yarmouth because Baltic fleets stayed in their home ports for fear of the Mongols has been famous ever since. Later historians drew attention to it. Alongside such vivid details, he repeats rumors, legends, and speculation, but taken as a whole, his work gives a striking picture of how educated Europeans perceived the Mongol danger in the 1240s. He also preserves in an appendix a valuable collection of letters from rulers and other notables discussing how to respond to the threat and lamenting the devastation it caused. Beyond these chronicles, there survives a significant body of diplomatic correspondence between European rulers and Mongol khans. Much of it involves the papacy, and most of the letters exchanged between popes and Mongol courts have now been gathered in modern editions. They provide rare direct testimony for the changing nature of contacts between the two worlds. Among individual Western observers, 2 Franciscan friars stand out for the quality of their reports: John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck. Carpini was sent by Pope Innocent IV in the 1240s, in the immediate aftermath of the Mongol attack on Europe. Traveling through Eastern Europe and the steppe as papal envoy, he reached the camp of the Great Khan near the capital at Karakorum in Mongolia. He was treated with formal politeness and eventually sent home bearing a letter from Khan Guyuk that demanded the submission of all Christian rulers and summoned the Pope and other princes to present themselves at the Mongol court. The main purpose of Carpini's mission, however, was reconnaissance. His history of the Mongols sets out his journey, what he learned about Mongol customs and organization, and above all, his assessment of their military strength and methods. He devotes a long section to the question of how European powers should prepare their defenses against a future invasion. 2 related versions of his report survive. One is Carpini's own. The other, usually known as the Tartar relation, includes important differences and may represent a variant account based on notes by his companion Benedict the Pole, who also produced a very short, independent narrative. The Tartar relation was discovered in a manuscript that also contained the now discredited Vinland map, but there is no serious doubt about its authenticity as a 13th century text. Carpini's journey made him famous on his return. Contemporary Franciscan writers describe him traveling across Europe, giving what we might think of as early lecture tours about his experiences. He was not the only papal envoy to the Mongols, however. Another mission, led by a Dominican called Asselin, set out for the Mongol commanders in the Middle East. The record of this expedition was written by Asselin's companion, Simon of St. Quentin. His account has not survived on its own, but was incorporated into a vast historical encyclopedia compiled by Vincent of Beauvais. Modern scholars have extracted it from that work and published it separately. Among other things, it contains a richly detailed description of the enthronement of Guyuk in 1246. fuller than Carpini's own, although it must be remembered that Simon was not actually present at the ceremony and was reporting secondhand. William of Rubruck's narrative, written a few years later than Carpini's, is longer, sharper, and more observant, yet it remained little known for centuries. Whereas Carpini's report exists in many manuscripts, Rubruck's itinerarium survives in only a handful, all in English collections. This odd concentration has led to the suggestion that the English thinker Roger Bacon, who knew Rubruck and took a keen interest in the Mongols, may have helped to preserve the text. Rubruck was sent east by King Louis IX of France, not as an official ambassador, but in the role of a missionary. Louis, who had already had disappointing experiences with formal embassies to the Mongols, refused to give him diplomatic credentials. This meant that Rubruck's journey was harder in practical terms, but he nevertheless reached Karakoram and held several audiences with the great Khan Mongol, who had seized power in 1251. Rubruck's book is a straightforward travel narrative written by a highly intelligent and critical observer. It provides a broader and more nuanced picture of the Mongol Empire than any earlier Western account. True to his missionary vocation, he is especially interested in religious life. He writes at length about the different faiths he encountered, paying particular attention to the communities of Eastern Christians often called Nestorians, whose Christology had been condemned as heretical in the Mediterranean world. This church had spread widely across Asia and enjoyed a measure of favor at the Mongol courts. The most dramatic episode in the itinerarium is his description of a grand public discussion held before Mongke, in which Rubruck, local Nestorian clergy, Muslim scholars, and Buddhist monks debated religious truth in the presence of the Khan. Rubruck naturally reports that he argued his case better than any rival, and he clearly believed it was crucial that he, not the Nestorians, should speak for Christianity. He paints a very harsh portrait of the Nestorian priests, accusing them of ignorance and asserting that they recited their liturgy and read their books in Syriac without actually understanding the language. After several years in Mongol lands, he returned to the eastern Mediterranean in 1255, carrying the now familiar type of letter from the Great Khan, calling on Western rulers to submit to his authority. About 20 years after William of Rubruck's journey, Marco Polo set out for the Far East. By the time he reached the court of Kublai Khan in China, the once unified Mongol Empire had already fragmented into several largely independent khanates. Europeans were no longer treated as utterly insignificant, and when he returned to Venice in 1295, he did not bring back a harsh demand for the submission of Christendom. Marco Polo's narrative is by far the most famous book ever written about the Mongol world, and with good reason. Unlike the Franciscan envoys, who traveled as papal agents and wrote under the pressure of diplomatic and religious missions, Polo looked at Asia through the eyes of a merchant and long-term resident. He spent roughly 2 decades in Mongol domains, most of them in service at the Yuan court in China. His account is more leisurely, anecdotal, and wide-ranging than the friar's reports, and although his contemporaries in Europe thought much of it wildly implausible, modern research has shown that a large part of his information is remarkably accurate. He saw more of the empire than any previous Western traveler. The friars who reached the Mongol heartland and even China left almost nothing like a sustained description of Chinese life. It is precisely this Chinese material that gives Polo's book its greatest value. Where he writes about regions through which he merely passed or repeats stories he heard from others, his grip can be less secure and mistakes naturally creep in. Yet historians of China generally recognize how reliable his portrait of Chinese government, cities, trade, and daily life really is. His career also illustrates a distinctive policy of the Mongol rulers in China. They often preferred to place foreigners or non-Chinese people in the more important administrative posts. They appear to have been wary of allowing the Chinese bureaucratic elite to dominate the state, and instead chose officials whose status depended entirely on Mongol favor. Polo was one such foreign servant, and his book gives us a rare insight into how that system looked from the inside. Over the centuries, many different translations and editions of his travels have appeared. Some are valued for their practical features, such as clear indexing, others for their philological precision, and scholars of Chinese civilization have repeatedly mined them to show how well-informed Polo actually was about the capital and the structure of Yuan rule. In one sense, European study of the Mongols began already in the 13th century, with writers such as John of Plano Carpini and Matthew Paris. Modern academic work, in the stricter sense, however, starts in the 18th century. The first substantial scholarly life of Chinggis Khan was published in France in 1710 by Paris de la Croix under the title Histoire du Grand Chinggis Khan. An English version followed in 1722, dedicated to the Prince of Wales, later George II, and prefaced with a highly imaginative comparison between the prince and the great conqueror. Paris de la Croix based his work mainly on Persian manuscripts, then available in the Royal Library of Louis XIV, including Rashid al-Din, and later compilers such as Mirquand. For its time, it was impressive and remains far from worthless even today. One of its most enduring effects has been the picture it gave of the so-called law code of Chinggis Khan, the Yasa. Much of that picture was mistaken, yet later writers adopted its outline so readily that the basic interpretation has often been repeated uncritically, even by people who have never opened Paris de la Croix's book. Because it came first, his framework quietly shaped many later assumptions about Mongol institutions. A generation later, another French scholar, the Jesuit Gobiel, produced an important Histoire du Chinggis Khan, published in 1739. Where Paris de la Croix had worked from Persian sources, Gobiel built his account primarily on Chinese materials, and so offered a very different angle. The first great full-scale modern history of the Mongols appeared in 1824, when Dosun brought out his Histoire des Mongols in 4 volumes. He relied mainly on Persian sources, but used them more critically and in closer contact with the earliest and most authoritative texts than his predecessors. Even today, scholars often describe this work as the best single comprehensive treatment in any European language, although it is probably praised more often than it is actually read. English contributions in this period were more modest. Gibbon's famous chapter on the Mongols, in the later volumes of his History of the Roman Empire, is still enjoyable reading. It is sharp, ironic, and colored by 18th century fascination with so-called noble savages, but it remains full of insight. During the 19th century, French scholarship again set the pace. Quatremer's edition and translation of part of Rashid al-Din, published in the 1830s, accompanied by enormous notes, is still one of the indispensable tools of Mongol historians. Later in the same century, the extraordinarily prolific Austrian Orientalist Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall produced lengthy works on the Mongols in Russia and Persia. Around the same time, the English scholar Haworth compiled his vast history of the Mongols in 4 volumes, published between the 1870s and 1880s. This enormous work did not add much to Doson in terms of interpretation and did not rest on direct use of the principal sources in Persian or Chinese, since Haworth could only consult them in translation. Nothing similar in scale has since been attempted in English. By contrast, one of the real monuments of Victorian scholarship was Sir Henry Yule's edition of Marco Polo. First issued in the 1870s and later expanded, its detailed notes and identifications stand alongside Quatremer's annotations on Rashid al-Din as a permanent scholarly achievement. The 20th century brought a series of standard works, firmly grounded in primary sources, which provided a much stronger base for later research. Barthold's study of Turkestan before the Mongol conquest, Bertold Spooler's books on the Golden Horde and on the Mongols in Iran, and the concluding volumes of Otto Franke's History of the Chinese Empire were especially important. A survey of research on Mongol Persia appeared in English as part of the 5th volume of the Cambridge History of Iran in the late 1960s, and a collective volume on China under Mongol rule summarized the reassessment carried out by modern sinology. As academic work has become more specialized, much of the most useful new research is now done by experts on relatively narrow questions such as Mongol taxation in one province or the organization of a particular military corps. Yet there is still an obvious need for writers who can draw these detailed studies together into broader syntheses. Among recent attempts, J.J. Saunders's History of the Mongol Conquests, published in the early 1970s, has rightly become the standard short introduction to the subject. Even so, study of the Mongol Empire is still in its early stages when compared with the vast scholarship on, for example, late medieval England or France. Until the early 1980s, there was not even a single really satisfactory biography of Chinggis Khan in any Western language. The only serious attempt of lasting value was H.D. Martin's book on his rise and conquest of North China, which covered only part of his career. Ideally, a modern biographer of Chinggis Khan would be equally at home in Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian, and able to use all 3 traditions firsthand. Earlier in the 20th century, there was one scholar who came close to this ideal, Paul Pelliot. His linguistic skills and critical intelligence were extraordinary. He produced many important articles and left a huge quantity of unpublished notes, which are still being edited and printed long after his death. Yet he never wrote a major book on Chinggis Khan, and the full potential of his learning was never captured in a single volume. Another Inner Asian specialist whose loss has been deeply felt is Joseph Fletcher of Harvard. He mastered a remarkable number of languages and possessed a rare combination of philology, historical imagination, and breadth of interest, but died at a relatively young age, leaving behind only a small body of published work of very high quality. His death removed one of the people best equipped to push Mongol studies forward. In more recent times, Paul Rachnevsky, one of Pelliot's students, has written a major biography of Chinggis Khan in German, drawing on Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian materials and using modern Russian editions and translations for parts of Rashid al-Din. This study finally goes a long way toward filling the long-standing gap. An English translation would be of great value. Compared with many other medieval fields, archaeology has so far made only a limited contribution to the history of the Mongols. The nomadic way of life does not generally leave behind deep urban layers of artifacts for archaeologists to uncover. Mobile camps, felt tents, and seasonal pastures vanish without trace once abandoned. Only when the Mongols began to control cities and to build fixed centers of power did they leave more conventional remains. Here, Russian archaeologists have played a leading role. They have excavated sites in Russia, including the capital of the Golden Horde at Sarai on the lower Volga, and have also undertaken major digs in Mongolia itself, especially on the site of the early imperial capital at Karakorum. Their findings are available mainly in Russian, though a concise overview has been provided in English by E.D. Phillips. Beyond these excavations, there is so far relatively little material that is specifically Mongol in focus. As medieval archaeology develops further in regions such as Iran and northern China, more evidence may emerge that will speak directly to the 13th and 14th centuries. There is always the possibility of a spectacular discovery, such as the burial place of Chinggis Khan, which tradition places somewhere in the remote mountains of northern Mongolia, concealed with great care. For now, however, the study of the empire rests above all on written sources, supported here and there by cautious use of anthropological comparisons with later nomadic societies and by the reports of 19th and 20th century travelers in Mongolia. It is unlikely that the full potential of these sources will be exhausted in the foreseeable future. The original heartland of the Mongols lay within the region of present-day Mongolia, near the eastern end of the enormous band of grassland that stretches from Manchuria all the way to the Hungarian plain. To the north of this land lay the vast Siberian forest, the taiga, and to the south the deserts, and beyond them, the fields and cities of settled civilization. Above all, China. The steppe itself is open grassland, largely treeless and generally unsuited to farming, although there were pockets of cultivable land, particularly in river valleys such as that of the Orkhon. For pastoral nomads, however, these grasslands were ideal. The economy rested primarily on herds of sheep and horses. Sheep provided wool for clothing and for the thick felts used to cover their portable round tents, known in Mongolian as gyrs, as well as meat, milk, and cheese for food and dung for fuel. Horses were essential for movement, hunting, and war. Men and goods alike moved on horseback or in carts drawn by animals. Mounted hunts were both a major source of meat and a form of training for war. Mare's milk, fermented into the drink known as kumis, was a key part of the diet of the nobility, and the high rates of early death among prominent Mongols suggest that heavy drinking played a part in their mortality. Camels and oxen also formed part of the pastoral economy. They were particularly useful for drawing heavy carts during seasonal migrations. As nomads, the Mongols moved their households and herds between summer and winter pastures. Typically, they would spend the warmer months on open plains and then move to more sheltered valleys for the cold season, since Mongolia is a land of mountains and uplands rather than endless flat grassland. These movements followed established routes between recognized pastures and did not involve random wandering. A yearly circuit of perhaps 100 miles was quite normal. Animal products alone could not supply everything people wanted or needed. The steppe peoples depended on trade with neighboring settled regions for grain, tea, worked textiles, luxury goods, and, above all, metal for weapons and tools. In return, sedentary societies valued horses, animal products, furs, and sometimes military service. In peaceful times, the relationship between steppe and zone was one of mutual dependence. Nevertheless, the nomads' attitude toward settled societies remained fundamentally predatory. They saw farming populations chiefly as providers of goods and tribute, and had little understanding of or sympathy for urban and agricultural ways of life, however much they might appreciate certain products. The Chinese, living directly south of the steppe and frequently threatened by raids, developed a sophisticated classification of their northern neighbors. They sometimes distinguished between so-called cooked and uncooked barbarians, the former being groups close to the frontier who had acquired more Chinese habits and knowledge, the latter living farther away and remaining less influenced. These distinctions often corresponded to geography. Tribes dwelling just beyond the line that would later be marked by the Great Wall were much more exposed to Chinese power and culture than peoples deep in the steppe. Along the northern frontier, Chinese governments prided themselves on careful control. In the 12th century, for example, the rulers of North China maintained garrisons, customs posts, and trading stations along a defended border. They also pursued deliberate policies towards nomadic politics. Officials kept a close eye on tribal leaders across the steppe. If one chief began to look too strong, he might receive less attention, while the Chinese would instead promote one of his rivals with gifts, titles, and subsidies, encouraging that rival to cut the rising power down to size. If the new favorite in turn became too dangerous, the process could be repeated. In this way, the empire tried to prevent any single steppe warlord from uniting the tribes. Much of the time, these tactics worked reasonably well. When they failed, as in the case of Chinggis Khan, the consequences were dramatic. Modern anthropologists have debated exactly how we should understand terms such as clan and tribe in nomadic societies. What is clear is that we go astray if we assume that tribes were simply extended families in which every member was tied by real blood descent to a common ancestor. In principle, Mongol and Turkic tribes claimed that kind of kinship, which helps explain the hundreds of highly artificial genealogies that fill many medieval sources. In practice, however, membership was far more flexible. Political allegiance, shared interest, and common obedience to a chief were often more important than genuine family ties. Only by recognizing this can we understand how Chinggis Khan managed to weld together such a varied collection of Mongol and Turkic groups, speaking different dialects and coming from different backgrounds, into a single military and political organization. He did not invent this practice. Rather, he pushed existing patterns further than anyone before him. Powerful leaders before his time had also drawn followers from different clans and tribes and incorporated defeated enemies into their own confederations. Within the tribal world, some lineages were regarded as noble. Chinggis himself belonged to such a family, whose ancestors had been important rulers in earlier generations. This noble status made him a credible candidate for leadership, but did not guarantee success. Chiefs had to prove their worth in war and in the management of their followers. Authority depended heavily on reputation. At a lower level, tribes were built from clans, known in Mongolian as obok. Some clans were subordinate, often because they had been defeated in war or had sought protection, while others were ruling lineages. Within those ruling families, kinship certainly mattered, But even there, the system allowed for a form of chosen kinship called anda, usually translated as sworn brotherhood. Two men who became anda pledged themselves to support one another as if they were real brothers. The secret history of the Mongols stresses the intense relationship between the young Temujin, later Chinggis Khan, and his anda Jamukha, who later became his bitter rival. Temujin also gained early advantages from the fact that his father had been anda to Togril, chief of the conquests, one of the most powerful steppe rulers of the time. Another pathway to political power was provided by the institution known as nukur. A man could abandon the loyalty he owed by birth to his natal clan and attach himself directly to a leader of his own choosing. By doing so, he became that man's nukur. The word is difficult to render into modern languages. Terms like companion, comrade, or retainer all catch part of its meaning. In the 13th century, it certainly did not mean servant in a humble sense. To attract nukur was to gather a circle of chosen associates who had committed themselves personally to a rising chief. In later Persian usage, the term slid down the social scale and came to mean household servant, but that reflects developments long after Chinggis Khan's time. By using the nukur system, a talented but obscure warrior could steadily build up a following if he possessed the necessary charisma and gifts of leadership. The secret history shows again and again how gifted men left their own clans to join Temujin and later played crucial roles as generals and counselors. Some historians have suggested that the growing importance of personal ties of this sort marks a shift away from strictly tribal organization toward something more like a feudal pattern, although the usefulness of that label for steppe society is debatable. Exogamy, the rule that marriages should take place outside the clan, also made the system more open. Women married into other groups and created networks of affinity between clans and tribes, which ambitious leaders could exploit to build alliances or claim support. In such a world, the position of a chief was never completely secure. Chieftainship was not seen as an automatic property of a particular person or as a simple matter of inheritance. It was an office that existed because followers needed war leaders and arbitrators. If a chief failed to protect his people, showed cowardice in battle, or lost his reputation, men might quietly drift away to serve someone else. When Chinggis Khan was proclaimed supreme ruler of the Mongols in 1206, many leading warriors voluntarily submitted to his authority. The secret history presents their speeches, in which they promise that he will have the first choice of captured horses and women and the best share of game killed in the hunt. More important, they swear unconditional obedience to his orders in time of war. In peacetime, however, the promise is much more limited. They undertake only not to act in ways that contradict his interests. Even this partial commitment was taken seriously. At one point, 3 subordinate chiefs disobeyed a clear instruction during a campaign and delayed in order to plunder. When this came to light, their spoils were seized as punishment. The Mongol Empire never became a rigid autocracy in which succession passed mechanically from eldest son to eldest son. Chinggis's nomination of his third son, Ögedei, as his successor was accepted largely because of the founder's immense prestige, yet even this was not enough to make succession smooth in later generations. After Ögedei's death in 1241, his chosen grandson was set aside and prolonged disputes ensued. Only in 1246 did Ögedei's son, Guyuk, managed to secure recognition. His death in 1248 prevented an open civil war with other members of the royal clan. Soon afterward, another branch of the family seized the throne in what amounted to a coup, later ratified by an assembly of nobles, a Kuriltai. At the next vacancy, two rival candidates were each elected by different Kuriltai gatherings, and the matter was settled by armed conflict. During both major interregna in the mid-13th century, the widow of the deceased Great Khan served as regent. This did not save Guyuk's widow from execution when her branch finally lost out, but it does show the relatively high status that elite women enjoyed in Mongol society. The secret history also emphasizes the respect Chinggis showed to the opinions of his mother and his principal wife, neither of whom came from his own tribe. His mother had originally been carried off by force by his father, which itself reflects a rough way of observing exogamy. Women could play political roles at court, lead households in the absence of men, manage flocks and herds, and occasionally even participate in war. Polygamy was common among the wealthy, but the chief wife had a special position. Only her sons were considered fully legitimate candidates for the supreme succession. Before their conversion to the religions of their subjects, the Mongols practiced a complex set of beliefs and rituals that modern scholars usually group under the label shamanism. No systematic theological treatise survives from the 12th or 13th centuries, but by combining hints in the secret history and in Chinese, Islamic, and European accounts with evidence from later oral traditions, we can gain a fairly clear picture. At its roots, Mongol shamanism grew out of ancestor veneration. Families kept images of their forebears in their tents. These were called ongot in the plural, ongon in the singular. They were thought to protect the household and its herds if honored properly. Over time, this ancestral cult became embedded in a wider system of deities and spirits. Above all stood the blue or eternal heaven, Tengri, a supreme sky power. The earth and fertility were associated with a goddess often named Itugen. Between humanity and these great forces lay a crowded spirit world. Shamans acted as intermediaries. In trance, they were believed to travel among the spirits, seek help, diagnose misfortune, or avert harm. A shaman usually wore distinctive garments, including white clothing and sometimes elaborate ornaments, rode a white horse, and carried certain ritual objects such as a staff and a drum. Their functions included interceding with spirits, driving away malign influences, blessing hunts, herds, and children, and foretelling the future. Divination was often performed by burning the shoulder blades of sheep and reading the resulting cracks, a method later tested experimentally by modern scholars. Shamans could become powerful figures. The secret history tells of a serious clash between Chinggis Khan and a leading shaman named Kokochu soon after Chinggis had been acknowledged as universal ruler at the Great Assembly of 1206. The story suggests that the shaman may have tried to claim a position above or beside the Khan, perhaps as the real source of authority. Chinggis is portrayed as deeply uneasy until Kokochu has been eliminated, and a supernatural explanation is invented for the disappearance of the shaman's body, presenting it as an act of divine judgment. Behind the legend lies a probable struggle between royal and priestly authority. Certain rituals were especially important. High places such as hilltops were considered sacred because they brought worshippers closer to the sky and thus to Tengri. The secret history describes Chinggis climbing a hill at a desperate moment in his early career, loosening his belt, uncovering his head, and bowing 9 times toward the heavens in order to seek heavenly favor. Later, writers saw similar behavior in other contexts, though sometimes without understanding its religious meaning. Sacrifices also played a role. Meat and sometimes entire horses could be offered by hanging them on poles. Purification by fire was another widely practiced rite. John of Plano Carpini, for example, was startled when, on approaching the camp of Batu Khan, he was required to pass between 2 fires as a way of cleansing him from any harmful influence he might bring. Shamanism among the early Mongols appears to have been almost entirely focused on practical concerns in this world. It offered guidance for health, prosperity, protection, and daily survival, rather than salvation after death. This may help explain why the Mongols were unusually open to the idea that other belief systems might also hold truth. As the scholar Heisig noted, it was a religion concerned with what had already happened and what affected life in the present, while concepts about an afterlife hardly played any role. Because of this, the adoption of Buddhism, Christianity, or Islam did not necessarily erase older customs. Even after later rulers publicly converted to a new faith, many shamanic practices continued quietly alongside it. The Mongols, in effect, preferred to secure spiritual protection from every possible source, rather than place their hopes in only one. The rise of the Mongol Empire did not happen in isolation. Long before Chinggis Khan united the tribes of Mongolia, other great confederations had ruled the grasslands. The most enduring of these earlier powers was that of the Xiongnu, who reached their height roughly between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, and continued to harass northern China for several more centuries. Some scholars believe that one branch of the Xiongnu may have later appeared in the West as the Huns, though this link remains debated. When steppe empires dissolved, fragments of defeated peoples often migrated westward, seeking fresh pastures and new power. After the fall of the Rouran Confederation in the 6th century, for example, a portion may have re-emerged in Europe as the Avars of Hungary. In terms of scale and impact, the most important pre-Mongol confederation was likely the Great Turkic Empire of the 6th and 7th centuries. Unlike many later nomadic conquests, it remained a purely steppe-based power. Yet its reach was so vast that both Chinese and Byzantine historians recorded its existence. Despite their significance, none of these early empires directly shaped Mongol power in an institutional sense. What they may have handed down was something less tangible: the memory of how a steppe empire could function. 2 other steppe powers, however, were far more relevant to Mongol development. When the Turkic Empire collapsed, Mongolia eventually fell under the control of the Uyghur Turks. From the mid-8th century onward, they ruled much of the region from their capital in the Orkhon Valley, not far from where the Mongols would later build their own imperial center at Karakorum. In 762, their rulers adopted Manichaeism as the official religion, a fact recorded in contemporary inscriptions. The Uyghur state later fractured, and groups of Uyghurs migrated south into the Tarim Basin. There they founded several oasis kingdoms which survived for centuries by paying tribute when necessary and avoiding large-scale warfare. Over time, they developed a sophisticated urban culture and refined administrative traditions. When Chinggis Khan rose to power, he recognized the value of their literacy, bureaucracy, and scribal experience. The Mongols had never previously possessed a written language, so they adopted the Uyghur script and absorbed Uyghur clerks into their own administration. Much of what gave structure to the early Mongol state, written records, seals, taxation methods, and chancery practice, owed a great deal to these former rivals turned allies. In the early 10th century, a semi-nomadic people from beyond the Great Wall established themselves as rulers of northern China. They were known as the Khitans, and under their rule, Chinese society gradually expanded deeper into Mongolia than ever before. Their language appears to have been closely related to early Mongolian, suggesting strong cultural links between them and the later Mongols. In the 12th century, however, the Khitans were overthrown by the Jurchen people, who created the Jin dynasty. Many Khitans fled westward and established a new empire in Central Asia known as Kara Khitai, remembered in Chinese records as the Western Liao. Their state combined steppe traditions with Chinese administration and eventually became a tolerant multi-religious realm where Chinese, Persian, and Turkic influences blended. Over time, the Chinese character of the state faded as cavalry forces and steppe military practices took precedence. Several regions under Kara Khitai rule maintained considerable autonomy, particularly in Transoxiana, and local dynasties continued to govern under nominal Khitan oversight. The Kara Khitai realm survived until the Mongols arrived. When Mongol armies advanced into Central Asia, the empire fell with little resistance, and many inhabitants welcomed the newcomers. This was one of the most important expansions of Mongol power, not because of military glory, but because the Mongols inherited intact a functioning administrative framework created by a people very close to themselves in language and tradition. Khitan scribes and officials who defected to the Mongols provided knowledge of taxation, government structure, and frontier management. In many ways, the Mongol Empire can be seen as a successor to Kara Khitai, though infinitely greater in scale and ambition. By the time Chinggis Khan unified the tribes of Mongolia in 1206, he faced three significant powers along his borders: the Jin Empire of northern China, the Tangut Kingdom of Xixia to the northwest, and the Uyghur principalities of the Tarim Basin. To the west lay the Islamic world, dominated not by a single ruler, but by a patchwork of regional states. The Khwarezmian dynasty in Central Asia was large, wealthy, and militarily strong, yet politically unstable. Its ruler faced internal rebellion, tension with religious elites, and a hostile relationship with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Further west, Saladin's successors ruled Egypt and Syria, while in Anatolia, the Seljuk Sultanate and the shrinking Byzantine Empire contested influence. None of these powers paid attention to events on the distant Mongolian steppe. Yet this quiet ignorance would soon give way to one of the most transformative conquests in world history. The long campaigns in northern China, with their advances, retreats, sieges, and plundering, matter most to those who study warfare itself. The movement of armies, the taking and retaking of cities, and the accumulation of spoils have been carefully described elsewhere, and only their broad outline need concern us here. In the beginning, the Mongols did not seem intent on seizing the Jin state as a permanent possession. Their early expeditions were aimed largely at extracting wealth, and enormous quantities of treasure were carried back to Mongolia. Peace agreements were arranged, gifts offered, and for a time these payments persuaded the invaders to withdraw. Yet every new spring saw the return of mounted armies, eager for further profit. The supposed puzzle of how they passed the Great Wall with ease dissolves when we remember that the wall familiar to us did not exist then, and the fortifications of the Jin were far to the north and much less formidable than later imagination has made them. Even so, the Jin state did not collapse quickly. It resisted stubbornly, drawing on reserves of manpower so large that defeat was never immediate. But raids gradually shifted into conquest. The northern capital, near the site of modern Beijing, fell in 1215, although its exposed location made it unsuitable as the center of resistance, and the court moved south to Kaifeng on the Yellow River. In the later stages of the war, Chinggis Khan directed his attention westward and left his trusted commander Mukhali to continue the struggle in China. By that time, the Mongol army could no longer rely solely on Mongol manpower. The region demanded huge numbers of troops, and many were needed elsewhere as well. China did not naturally lend itself to pure steppe-style warfare. Sieges were unavoidable, and the terrain was unlike the open plains of Mongolia. Many Chinese soldiers and officials, seeing which way fortune moved, abandoned the Jin and entered Mongol service. Not all under Jin rule felt loyal to their masters. The Khitans, once rulers before the Jin displaced them, had reason to defect. Many Chinese still viewed the Jin as northern outsiders with only a century's claim to legitimacy. Some officials, whether Chinese or Khitan, later helped shape the administrative machinery of the Mongol state itself. While this struggle unfolded, another matter demanded attention. Kuklug, heir of the old Nayman enemies, had seized control of the Karakitai realm and ruled it in name, though his actions weakened it from within. Much of its land, including the rich cities of Transoxiana such as Samarkand and Bukhara, had already fallen to the Khwarezmian rulers. When the Mongols turned their gaze in that direction, they found the region fractured and vulnerable. Their understanding of local affairs was already strong, especially since the Uyghurs of Turfan had submitted years earlier and hosted a Mongol garrison. In 1218, a Mongol army under Jebe moved to eliminate Kuchlug entirely. With his fall, the Karakitai domains passed to Mongol control almost without resistance, as the population, freed from his harsh measures, welcomed a change of lordship. By then, the western frontier of the expanding empire touched that of the Khwarezm Shah, Ala al-Din Muhammad. What Chinggis intended regarding this powerful neighbor is uncertain. He addressed the Shah in a manner that implied mutual recognition, calling himself ruler of the East and the Shah ruler of the West, though at the same time he referred to him as his son, which scarcely suggested equality. One minor clash had already taken place when Khwarezmian troops attacked a Mongol detachment pursuing fleeing Merkits. That incident could have been ignored, and perhaps Chinggis wished to avoid further conflict while China remained unfinished. Yet events soon placed war beyond choice. A caravan from Mongol lands, 450 strong, entered the frontier city of Otrar. The governor accused them of spying and had them all killed, seizing their goods. A survivor fled back to Mongolia, and the Khan demanded justice. 3 envoys were sent, but one was executed, and the others humiliated. To harm a diplomat was an unforgivable insult in Mongol judgment. Punishment became inevitable, and Khwarezm, whether by accident or provocation, became the next target. The Shah had established his seat at Samarkand, and it was Transoxiana that felt the first strike when the Mongols advanced in 1219 along 3 separate lines of attack. Confused and mistrustful of his own troops, the Shah failed to confront them directly. His forces remained dispersed in garrisons and were overcome piece by piece. He fled westward, pursued by a Mongol contingent, and died in exile on an island in the Caspian. His failure remains difficult to explain. His realm was new and fragile, but his earlier campaigns had shown ability. Whether fear, indecision, or arrogance clouded his judgment, the chance to resist was lost. The devastation that followed was immense. The lands of Khorasan were put to the sword over several years by Tolui, the youngest son of the Khan, and what had once been prosperous cities were reduced to shells. It seems that Chinggis did not intend to absorb all this territory immediately. Viceroys were appointed, but his primary aim was punishment and the removal of a rival power before it could rise again. Jalal al-Din, son of the fallen Shah, fought on, and for a time became a figure of legend, maneuvering brilliantly in the field, yet wasting strength by warring against many enemies rather than focusing on the Mongols alone. He died without altering the course of history, though bands of his former soldiers continued to trouble the region for years. One such force later played a role in expelling the Crusaders from Jerusalem. Around this time, the Khan, feeling age approach, summoned the Taoist sage Chang Chun from distant China, hoping for knowledge of immortality. The sage offered no miracle, merely advice for moderation in hunting and rest in solitude. Still, Chinggis valued his words and granted favors to his religious followers. A disciple recorded the journey, leaving us a vivid picture of Asia after the storm of conquest. The army returning from Khwarezm did not retrace its steps, but rode north of the Caspian and across the Caucasus, gathering intelligence for future campaigns that would later reach Russia and Eastern Europe. The Khan himself returned to Mongolia in 1223 with one task unfinished. Xixia, the Tangut kingdom, had refused to provide troops for Western operations, despite being bound to do so. Chinggis marched south once more and subdued it completely. But before its ruler was put to death and the state extinguished, he himself died in 1227. His burial place was kept secret, somewhere high in the mountains of Mongolia, a site he had chosen long before. Thus ended the life of one of history's greatest conquerors. Whether his brilliance surpassed that of Alexander Caesar or Napoleon is not easy to measure, yet many have ranked him among the most formidable commanders the world has seen. Some imagine a grand strategic plan behind his actions, a belief that he sought first to secure the steppe, then to neutralize China temporarily, then to unify all nomadic peoples before turning again to conquer China fully. It is an elegant interpretation, though we cannot confirm whether he thought in those terms, or whether events simply unfolded that way. What cannot be doubted is the scale of destruction unleashed. The early Mongol wars in northern China lasted a quarter of a century, and one often repeated tale claims that they considered killing the entire population of the former Jin lands and reducing the region to pasture, abandoning the idea only when advised that taxation of a living people would yield more profit than empty grassland. To the west, the ruin of Transoxiana and Khorasan reached depths scarcely imaginable. Chroniclers wrote in horror of slaughter beyond counting, describing cities emptied and fields left to dust. Their figures for the dead are surely exaggerated, yet exaggeration itself reflects the trauma. Perhaps a city did not hold millions, as some claimed, but the fact that such numbers were believed indicates the scale of shock. Excavated sites today help confirm both ruin and absence. The old ground of Samarkand is now a broad plateau ringed by mud brick walls, enclosing little more than a line of shrines and empty space. Balkh is scarcely more than a village amid fallen ramparts. These places could never have supported the vast populations described if we take numbers literally, yet the physical silence of the land speaks loudly enough. Where life once flourished, the Mongol sword left long memory. The worst damage, however, was not only the loss of life, but the collapse of irrigation. The Persian plateau depends not on great rivers, but on underground water channels that need constant upkeep. When villagers fled or died, the channels failed, and land that once yielded crops fell swiftly back into desert. Even untouched cities could not survive without the rural world that fed them. Later wars and dynasties added further strain, yet the initial blow delivered by the early Mongol conquests seems to have been the turning point from which recovery was partial and slow. Not every region suffered equally. Southern Persia, less suited to steppe settlement, escaped the worst, and some areas revived rapidly where trade routes thickened under Mongol rule. Travelers in later generations saw lands thriving again, even as others lay abandoned. In China, too, conquest of the Song was conducted with more interest in preservation than annihilation. Still, the population decline in the century that followed suggests that war, famine, and disease combined to reshape the demographic landscape. Despite the catastrophe, Mongol expansion continued for decades after the founder's death. Only around the middle of the 13th century did the empire reach its fullest shape, and even then, its rulers did not imagine themselves finished. Later, admiration has coined phrases like Pax Mongolica, yet such words risk masking how fragile peace was once the storm had passed. Their rule quieted trade routes and linked continents, but the calm they created was carved first through devastation. Above all, the empire rested not on administration or ideology, but on the army that forged it. To understand Mongol rule is to understand their military organization, for war was not an event, but a condition of life. Hunting was training, riding was instinct, and every man was a soldier. The decimal structure of their forces, built in tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, gave order to this warrior society, and the elite imperial guard bound its leaders by loyalty beyond tribe or clan. In reshaping the fabric of steppe society and transferring allegiance from tribal kinship to the house of Chinggis, the empire gained a core of unity that would endure even through violent succession and civil war. The sword made the empire, and discipline held it together. In the early Mongol era, soldiers received no fixed wages. What sustained them was plunder, which was shared out according to long-established rules. Serving in the army was not considered a profession, but a duty expected of every able warrior, and instead of drawing salaries, they contributed provisions known as kubshur to support comrades who were poor, wounded, or permanently disabled. This system worked only while new territories continued to fall, and war brought a constant supply of goods. Once expansion slowed and the flow of spoils declined, the arrangement became increasingly impractical. In China, the Mongol military eventually shifted to a salary-based structure, beginning with higher officers who were even permitted to pass their commands on to their sons. A different solution emerged in Persia, where the Ilkhan Ghazan attempted to secure military income by allocating agricultural lands to soldiers as revenue estates, their harvest taking the place of formal pay. The backbone of the army was light cavalry, armed with composite bows of wood reinforced with horn and sinew. These weapons required enormous strength to draw, yet they could be fired accurately from horseback, with powerful penetration and remarkable range. For centuries, no firearm equaled the rate of fire, distance, or killing force of the steppe bow, and mounted archers of the Crimean steppes were still fighting effectively in Europe long after gunpowder had appeared. Alongside these horse archers rode heavy cavalry in lamellar armor, carrying lances for shock combat. Where fortifications stood in the way, siege technicians drawn from China and the Middle East supplied engines and mechanical expertise the nomads lacked. The conquest of such a vast domain could never have been achieved by Mongol troops alone. Chinese forces were absorbed early and in great numbers, especially during operations against the Song dynasty, where walls, canals, and paddy fields rendered pure cavalry tactics useless. Chinese infantry served as garrison troops once territories were pacified, and in Persia, local levies guarded mountain passes and frontier routes. Defeated populations were pressed into service in more brutal ways as well. Captives from one fallen city were driven ahead of Mongol troops when storming the next, shielded only by the defenders' reluctance to kill their own people. Encirclement modeled on hunting formations, feigned retreats, synchronized multi-column advances, sudden appearances through near impassable terrain, and calculated terror formed the core of their method. Though mass killing was commonplace, the Mongols moved swiftly rather than indulging in torture for its own sake. Cruelty was used as an instrument, not entertainment. A single horrific massacre would often make surrounding cities surrender without a fight, and the Mongols usually honored their word when a population yielded without resistance. A key feature of their military-political organization was the Tama system. These were composite field armies drawn from all available manpower and stationed on the fringes between pasture land and settled regions. Such forces were created by imperial decree and served as occupation corps, consolidating new conquests and expanding control outward. Many later developed into the permanent armies of regional khanates. The central Great Khanate maintained its own elite guard, from which sons of Chinggis were granted patrimonial armies, each raised according to decimal divisions and originally formed on Tama principles. One such force can be traced with unusual clarity. A contingent later known as the Karanas, positioned between northern India and eastern Persia. They were composed of members of many Mongol lineages, illustrating how Chinggis reshaped tribes into military units. Over time, they fragmented, some siding with the Ilkhans and others with the Chaghatides, revealing the fluidity of steppe loyalties beneath imperial structure. Much later, tradition claimed that Chinggis Khan issued a great legal code that served as the foundation of Mongol governance, yet evidence for such a codified law is elusive. It seems more likely that what existed was a body of fluid customary law maintained through precedent, reinforced by remembered sayings of the founder and recorded case by judicial officers. These accumulations of rulings, preserved in writing for particular disputes, may have been mistaken by later generations as a single authoritative code. The notion of a fixed, comprehensive yasa probably grew from memory, reverence, and the gradual halo of legend surrounding the early empire rather than from a tangible statute collection. Taxation under Mongol administration followed no neat blueprint. The steppe tradition distinguished tribute from levy, both paid in goods rather than money. A term inherited from the nomadic world, kubshur, came to denote a poll tax imposed on conquered agricultural populations after a census, though its earlier meaning referred to contributions taken from herds. Another levy, Qualan, fell irregularly and arbitrarily upon settled communities and was deeply resented for its unpredictability. Commerce was also taxed through tamga, a percentage charge on mercantile activity and services, reflecting the Mongols' strong commitment to trade and its profits. The overriding aim across conquered regions was extraction rather than equitable administration. Peasants were expected to produce enough to survive only so that they could be taxed again the following year. The load increased further because older Islamic taxes continued alongside Mongol ones, and real moderation appeared only where experienced bureaucrats, especially Persians, curbed excess to prevent productive collapse. Effective rule over so immense a territory required fast communication. The Mongols developed an extensive relay system of mounted couriers known as the Yam, a network of stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart, each supplied with fresh horses and provisions. Officials and envoys traveled under authority of inscribed tablets of rank, and urgent messages could cross continents with astonishing speed by riders who switched mounts continuously without rest. Abuse by nobles and merchants was common, but despite this, the system functioned on a scale no previous empire had attempted, influencing postal infrastructure in regions far beyond its original borders. In government, the Mongols seldom hesitated to adopt what worked. They absorbed administrative techniques from peoples who had ruled cities long before them, especially Uyghurs and Khitans, whose institutional practices helped convert a nomadic coalition into an imperial machine. The office of the Darugachi, for example, seems to have stemmed from Khitan models of provincial oversight, later reshaped into a Mongol supervisory post that monitored taxation, justice, and loyalty. Yet the Mongols applied these borrowed mechanisms differently depending on the region. In Persia, experienced local officials formed the backbone of administration, while Mongols remained a ruling elite concerned primarily with revenue. In China, by contrast, Chinese scholars were largely excluded from high office for many decades, and foreigners, Muslims from Central Asia, Uyghurs, Khitans, Europeans, were placed in positions of trust, considered loyal precisely because they had no independent base of power. The court restored certain Chinese institutions only gradually, and examinations for civil service returned late and never with their former prestige. This pragmatic governance reflected a simple principle: any system or personnel were acceptable so long as Mongol supremacy remained unchallenged and wealth continued to flow upward. The empire was not built on uniform statecraft, but on the flexible use of administrative cultures already developed by others, bound together by the military force that made and held the empire. After the death of the founder, power did not immediately fracture. Chinggis had indicated that Ögedei should inherit supreme authority, and this succession proceeded with only muted tension. Under Ögedei, conquests continued in both east and west. Russia was overrun, and the northern Chinese state was subdued. It was also in his time that a permanent capital was established at Karakoram, though it remained little more than a logistical center rather than an urban marvel. When Ögedei died, faction and delay preceded the rise of Guyuk, whose rule was short and whose death reopened the issue of succession. Only with the accession of Mongke did stability return, though even this peace dissolved at his death, for his brothers Kubilai and Arik Boka each declared themselves ruler, plunging the empire into civil war. Victory eventually fell to Kubilai, who then directed the final conquest of the Song dynasty in the south. Once China was fully subdued, Kubilai ruled from the great cities rather than from the steppe, supporting agriculture, preserving landholders, and maintaining the administrative skeleton already familiar to Chinese subjects. Campaigns continued, yet they rarely matched earlier triumphs. The island power of Japan remained beyond reach. Storms shattered 2 invasion fleets, and the survivors were destroyed ashore. Southeast Asian jungles and monsoon seas proved ill-suited to the tactics of steppe war, and despite some gains in Yunnan, these ventures achieved little compared to the vast victories of the previous generation. Still, Kubilai never forgot his origins. Tradition holds that he kept a patch of open steppe grass in his palace to remind him of the life from which the empire had risen. The Mongol achievement in China did not endure long after his death, but the imprint remained. The integration of Yunnan into China, the reshaping of institutions through foreign and nomadic influence, and the memory of an empire that for a time stretched across most of the known world. The most visible signs of how Mongol government in China evolved under Kubilai were his decision to assume a formal Chinese dynastic name and the establishment of a new imperial capital at Peking. In 1272, he proclaimed that the ruling house would henceforth be known as the Yuan, a title meaning origin, reportedly presented to him by the scholar Liu Pingcheng. Unlike earlier Chinese dynasties, which had usually taken titles tied to their ancestral homeland, this name avoided geography and instead reached into philosophical symbolism. The choice may have been deliberate, for a reference to the steppes would hardly have convinced the Chinese literati that the newcomers were rightful heirs of the imperial tradition. Once military conquest was complete and resistance from Song loyalists faded, most officials and scholars accepted Mongol rule, relying on the old belief that the transfer of power itself signaled heaven's approval. Yet Kubilai's reform was subtle as well as bold. By selecting a title rooted in classical cosmology, he presented the new dynasty as a continuation of Chinese imperial legitimacy, not an intrusion from outside. Even after the Mongols lost power, their successors did not deny that legitimacy. The Ming claimed that heaven's favor had moved to them only after Yuan rule had run its course. The same year saw the renaming of the capital at Peking as Dadu, Great Capital, though Mongols themselves more often called it Khanbalik, the city of the Khan, a form preserved in Marco Polo's accounts. To the north stood Shangdu, favored as a summer palace and remembered in later poetry as Xanadu. Work on Dadu had begun years earlier, and its layout followed ancient Chinese prescriptions for an ideal imperial city as described in classical statecraft literature. A mobile empire built on the saddle now rooted itself in stone, and that shift had enormous consequences. As Mongol rulers drew closer to Chinese culture, the question arose whether they would abandon the shamanic traditions of the steppe in favor of the faiths of the empire they now governed. Their ancestral practices never disappeared. Shamanism, fluid and unstructured, could nest comfortably beside other beliefs. Many Chinese officials themselves blended philosophies without conflict, serving government while honoring Confucian ethics and Buddhist ideas simultaneously. Taoism, initially favored due to early Mongol encounters with its masters, gradually lost prominence. Confucian teaching, though central to the intellectual world of China, did not seem to capture Kubilai's personal loyalty, even if later Yuan emperors viewed it more warmly. Instead, Kublai gave his patronage to Buddhism, yet not to the refined monastic tradition most esteemed by Chinese scholars. He embraced the esoteric form practiced in Tibet, a blend of Buddhist doctrine with ritual and magical elements. The appeal may have rested in familiar echoes of shamanic belief, for Tibetan lamas commanded ritual power that impressed steppe sensibilities. Although Tibet was nominally included within the empire, direct control was limited, and the land remained troublesome. However, Kublai drew close to leading Tibetan clerics, especially the Sakya lineage, whose influence extended even to Persia before the conversion of Ghazan to Islam. From this circle emerged Phagpa, the lama who became spiritual advisor to the emperor and held high rank at court. He shaped Mongolia's understanding of Buddhist world sovereignty, framing Kublai as a universal monarch in the Buddhist tradition of the cosmic ruler. Through this partnership, Tibetan Buddhism rose to preeminence in the Yuan state. Under imperial command, Phagpa also created a new script to replace the Uyghur alphabet then used for Mongolian. The new writing was elegant, systematically organized, and for a time enforced in administration. Although examples survive, it never fully replaced the older script, which continued in use deep into later centuries. After the final collapse of the Jin dynasty, northern China was divided into princely fiefs. But when the south fell to Kublai, this arrangement changed. It was long assumed that China then became a tightly centralized state, divided into provinces controlled directly from the capital. Modern study has shown a more complex picture. Outside the metropolitan region surrounding Dadu, imperial authority was weaker and more uneven than once believed. Administration functioned less through county magistrates and more through layers of specialized government bureaus that operated with limited oversight. The emperor controlled appointments and could intervene, yet much authority rested in provincial structures that imitated those of the central court without always answering to it. The ruling population itself was stratified into 4 groups. At the top, Mongols; below them, Western and Central Asian peoples favored as allies; next, the inhabitants of former Jin territories; and finally those of former Song lands, who ranked lowest and gained political access only slowly. Government under the Mongols is unlikely to have been gentle, yet modern scholarship sees the period with greater balance than older assessments allowed. Chinese culture continued to advance rather than stagnate. Literature, painting, and dramatic writing flourished partly because Mongol rulers did not keep close watch over the scholar class, and partly because educated men, excluded from high office, turned their energy to the arts instead. Private academies multiplied, and the study of the classics survived despite the absence of examination-based civil appointments. The empire also enjoyed long stretches of peace, and economic life improved, especially after the reopening and extension of the Grand Canal, which linked the grain-rich south to the new capital in the north. Commercial contact with the world widened. Envoys, merchants, and curious travelers came by land and sea, among them the Polos, who journeyed to China and later returned by ocean route. Their presence left no trace in Chinese archives, and Marco Polo's own claims of high office are doubtful, yet their voyage reflects the openness of the empire's trading routes. A few other foreign clerics and envoys reached the Yuan court, though only one, John of Marignoli, appears in the official history, and even then only because he brought a monumental horse admired by the court painters. Chinese resentment of foreign rule did exist, but it was neither deep nor lasting on a national scale. The first Ming emperor discouraged the imitation of Mongol dress and custom, yet held no strong hatred for the people themselves, and even retained steppe soldiers in his own service. Discontent grew later, only when renewed Mongol incursions threatened China. Over time, Mongol authority weakened, corroded by factionalism, flood and famine, and epidemics that ravaged the population. Rebellions spread, led by ambitious warlords and peasants alike. The court, deprived of clear strategy, lashed out in confusion, and one advisor famously proposed solving China's unrest by executing everyone who bore a handful of common surnames, an absurd suggestion that revealed the intellectual exhaustion of the dynasty's final years. Driven from Peking in 1368, the last Yuan emperor retreated northward. Chinese rule returned under the new Ming dynasty, while Mongolia remained beyond their grasp. The fragments of empire withdrawn to the steppe would endure in altered form, but China no longer belonged to riders of the north. The once dominant Yuan line survived only in memory, and the walls that later rose across northern China proclaimed the limits of Ming ambition, sealing the boundary the Mongols had once crossed without resistance. Christian communities in Syria had not enjoyed any special privilege under Mongol occupation. What they experienced was simply the standard Mongol habit of allowing all religions space to function, rather than any deliberate favoritism. From a Western perspective, however, earlier encounters with Mongol armies had been terrifying, unpredictable, and destructive, so there was little reason for contemporaries to imagine the newcomers as potential allies. Egypt, under the new Mamluk rulers, also appeared unstable, and no one in 1260 could have foreseen how strong and resilient that regime would soon become. In that moment, the Crusader leadership responded realistically to what they saw. Only later did the more cooperative tone adopted by the Ilkhans from the early 1260s onward lead historians to misjudge how bleak the situation looked at the time. Events unfolding elsewhere soon reshaped the entire political landscape. While Hulagu was fighting in Syria, news reached him that the great Khan Mungke had died in China, and his brothers Kubilai and Arikboke were moving toward a struggle for succession. The uncertainty was serious enough to force Hulagu to pull most of his forces out of Syria and withdraw toward northwestern Iran, leaving only a reduced army under Kitbuka. A parallel has often been drawn with the consequences of Ögedei's death in 1241, which had abruptly halted the westward thrust into Europe. Hulagu later told Louis IX of France that his withdrawal had also been caused by lack of pasture after so many horses had grazed the land bare, and this explanation, at the very least, matches the logistical problems that were inevitable for an army so large and so far from its base. Whatever the combination of reasons, Kitbuka faced the Mamluk commander Qutuz at Ain Jalut, near a spring in Galilee remembered in earlier tradition. In a battle that became famous, the Mongols were beaten, Kitbuka was killed or captured and then executed, and further fighting drove the invaders out of Syria altogether. Hulagu vented his anger on his captive rival al-Nasir Yusuf, who was put to death. With this, Syria became firmly a province of the Mamluk Sultanate, although Qutuz himself was murdered shortly afterwards, and Baybars, one of the conspirators, took the throne and shaped Mamluk power for decades to come. Ain Jalut is often celebrated as the turning point that halted Mongol expansion in the Middle East, though it would be too simple to claim that one battle alone checked an unstoppable empire. Its psychological effect was huge. for it proved that Mongol armies could be defeated, although only under unusually favorable conditions. In later years, Mongol forces entered Syria several times, and even held all of it briefly in 1300 before withdrawing again. Conditions in the region worked against long-term occupation. The pasture lands, especially in the south, were insufficient for steppe cavalry on repeated campaigns, and this chronic limitation undermined every attempt to hold Syria permanently. At the same time, the wider political cohesion of the empire was dissolving. After 1260, large-scale invasions could no longer rely on full support from all branches of the Mongol world. Hulagu's quarrel with Berke of the Golden Horde escalated into war around 1261 or 1262, and Baybars in Egypt quickly exploited the hostility between the two Khanates. The Mamluk ruler needed both a diplomatic partner and a supply of new slave soldiers, most of whom were sourced from territories under the Golden Horde. But reaching Berke posed a logistical problem, since Ilkhanid control of Persia and much of Anatolia blocked the direct land route. Communication therefore depended on passage by sea around Constantinople, which was held by the Latin powers and no ally of Cairo. When Byzantine forces retook Constantinople in 1261, the balance shifted slightly, and a path for Mamluk Golden Horde cooperation began to open. Religious life in Ilkhanid Persia did not adopt one single identity. Buddhism left surprisingly clear material traces, particularly in two cave complexes identified through their resemblance to Central Asian Buddhist architecture. These survives only because their chambers were carved into rock and later converted for Islamic use. Both are located near Maraga, the first Ilkhanid capital, which makes their Buddhist origin highly plausible. Yet it would be misleading to imagine that Buddhism dominated public life. The ruling elite preferred religious neutrality, and the privileges that Islam had enjoyed before the conquest disappeared. The poll tax on non-Muslims was lifted, and communities such as the Jacobites and Nestorians flourished. A major figure of the era was the Nestorian patriarch Yabalaha III, originally a monk from Inner Mongolia named Mark, who had traveled west with Rabban Soma. Their pilgrimage never reached Jerusalem, but Mark rose to lead the entire Nestorian hierarchy from Iraq, where Nestorian influence spread across much of Asia with remarkable energy. Financial policy under the Ilkhans was unstable and often brutal. Under Argun, the Jewish vizier Sad al-Dawla attempted to enforce tax collection efficiently, even by harsh methods, and he managed to balance the state accounts. His success earned him resentment among both Mongols hungry for quick plunder and Persians offended by his background. When Argun fell ill, rivals engineered Sad al-Dawla's execution. His successor, Sadr al-Din, confronted an empty treasury, economic damage from livestock disease, and a collapsing revenue base. In desperation, he introduced paper currency modeled on Chinese chow, complete with Chinese inscriptions alongside the Muslim declaration of faith. The experiment froze commerce almost instantly, and the paper money had to be withdrawn, tarnishing the minister's reputation beyond recovery. New rulers followed one another rapidly. Gaikatu, amiable but careless, was overthrown, and Baidu briefly took the throne until Ghazan seized power. Ghazan set out to reform administration and restore order. Taxation was regularized, weights and measures standardized, the postal relay network repaired, and land long abandoned was encouraged back into cultivation. There is evidence of short-term improvement, Later officials claimed revenue rose by several million dinars annually. But Ghazan ruled only a few years, and as soon as pressure from above lessened, corruption resurfaced. His measures tied peasants more firmly to the soil, perhaps formalizing what practice already enforced, and large amounts of property were converted into religious endowments, suggesting persistent mistrust of the state. Even so, his conversion to Islam and his support for settled life accelerated the gradual blending of Mongol elites into Persian society. Intermarriage became common, and within generations, Mongol identity melted into the dominant Turkic-Persian culture. Unlike China, Persia did not expel the conquerors. The conquerors became part of Persia itself. Ghazan's brother Olyetu continued his policies while shifting the capital from Tabriz to Sultaniya, where his monumental mausoleum still stands. His son Abu Sa'id, the last Ilkhan of Hulagu's line, ruled first under competing factions and then with increasing confidence. Without a chronicler equal to Rashid al-Din or Juwayni, details of his reign are harder to reconstruct, yet tradition remembered his years as unusually stable, and he became the first Ilkhan to conclude peace with the Mamluks. Retrospectively, these decades were recalled as a period of order and prosperity before the line disappeared. In contrast to Persia, the Mongols of the Golden Horde retained their nomadic base far more fully. Their endurance rested on geography. The grasslands along the lower Volga placed them close enough to dominate Russia, but far enough to avoid assimilation into a sedentary population. So long as they lived on the steppe, their military advantage survived. When Mongol states elsewhere settled and softened, the horde preserved the ways of the plain. Awareness of the Mongols reached Western Europe gradually and often through confusion. Exotic coins probably carried from Central Asia reached the English treasury around 1241, and one theory links them to envoys from Alamut, whose assassins held large stores of Gurid gold. But earlier knowledge of Asia had come mostly through legend. Classical geography and the myths of Alexander still shaped imagination, and fantastical races such as headless men or one-footed giants populated unexplored lands. The story of Prester John, endlessly embroidered, placed a Christian king somewhere beyond the Islamic world, ready to rescue Christendom. Reports of Chinggis Khan were at first folded into this hope. An unnamed King David, who defeated Muslims near India, was thought to be Prester John's heir. When no help came, Europeans slowly realized that these victories were Mongol conquests in Khwarezm, not miracles in their favor. Real intelligence arrived only when Friar Julian of Hungary traveled east in the 1230s and witnessed the opening of Batu's campaign. Soon after, Europe felt the shock directly as Mongol cavalry crossed into Poland and Hungary. Panic letters circulated across courts and bishoprics. Pope Innocent IV responded by sending embassies to learn what could be done, to seek protection for Christians in Asia, and to encourage unity among Eastern churches. One mission reached Baiju in Anatolia, but angered him by refusing Mongol demands. Only the Franciscan John of Plano Carpini reached Mongolia itself. His report on Mongol warfare and state organization was the first detailed European account, but it offered little comfort. The Great Khan's reply demanded submission and tribute. To Mongol eyes, the world was destined to fall under their rule, and any ruler who had not submitted was considered a rebel against heaven's mandate. Negotiation on equal terms was impossible. Yet there were moments of cautious optimism. Envoys reached Louis IX in Cyprus in 1248, claiming friendship and even conversion among Mongol commanders. The French king sent Andrew of Longjumeau east with gifts, only to learn that the great Khan had died and that the regent simply treated his embassy as an act of submission. Louis regretted the mission bitterly and sent no further ambassadors. William of Rubruck later traveled to Mongolia independently, not as a royal envoy, but as a missionary, and wrote the most perceptive Western description of Mongol life. His manuscript, however, circulated little and rose to prominence only centuries later. A genuine shift came after 1260, when the Ilkhans of Persia, threatened by both Mamluks and Golden Horde, sought Western allies. They proposed joint campaigns to retake Syria, promising Jerusalem to the Crusaders in exchange for coordinated advance. Letters crossed between Persia and the courts of France and England. For a time, channels remained open. Commercial relations thrived even when military plans stalled, and papal missions continued. The Church built its structure across Asia, designating Sultania as an archbishopric and placing the Franciscan mission to China under the Archbishop of Khanbalik. John of Montecorvino, first Catholic archbishop in China, labored for decades, writing home about his work, but his efforts faded with the fall of the Yuan. Sultania's archdiocese lasted longer and into the 15th century. During these years, the Nestorian monk Rabban Sauma traveled west at the request of Arghun. His Persian narrative, preserved only in Syriac summary, recounts his journey through Constantinople, Italy, and France, where he met Byzantine emperors, cardinals, Philip IV, Edward I, and finally Pope Nicholas IV, for whom Arghun later named his son. His writing gives Europe seen through Eastern eyes, a mirror opposite to the accounts of Carpini, Rubruck, and Marco Polo. In that rare perspective lies perhaps the deepest window into the short season when alliance seemed possible, before the last Ilkhans disappeared and the idea faded with them. His account of Europe is strikingly generous, far more positive than one would expect from a writer shaped by Islamic intellectual traditions. This warmth is easier to understand once we remember that the observer was a Christian cleric who found himself in the very center of the faith he cherished. His deepest enthusiasm was directed toward holy relics, and Rome, overflowing with sacred remains, seemed to him a treasure house without equal. Before he departed, he persistently requested permission to take relics home to Persia. The Pope, both amused and kindly, agreed to grant him a few, remarking that if relics had been distributed as freely as pilgrims desired, even vast mountains of sacred matter would have vanished centuries earlier. But since the visitor had come from such distance, he would not be sent away empty-handed. The narrative he left behind stands alone, a solitary voice preserved in Syriac, the language of a minority community. Its value lies not in quantity, but in rarity, in the sharpness of its observation, and in the way it reveals a viewpoint belonging to a corner of Persian society that briefly enjoyed influence and royal favor beyond anything it had known before or would know again. Through it, we glimpse the hopes and convictions of a man who believed sincerely in the possibility of cooperation between the Mongol world and Latin Christendom during the 13th century. Yet he spoke only for his own religious circle. His optimism did not reflect the dominant attitude within Muslim Persia. To understand that broader perspective, we must look to the writings of Rashid al-Din. Rashid al-Din included a history of the Western Christians in the latter portion of his vast universal chronicle, completed at the request of Ul Yaitu after the death of Ghazan. It has often been described as the first and perhaps the only attempt by a medieval Muslim historian to summarize the past of Latin Europe, and the significance of the work lies less in its factual content than in the very fact of its existence. The material is arranged in two sections. First, a survey of the various kingdoms of Europe, then a chronological sequence of events running from the birth of Christ to Rashid al-Din's own age, organized by the reigns of popes and Western emperors. His principal guide appears to have been a widespread Latin chronicle composed in the late 13th century by a Dominican known as Martin of Troppau, whose work circulated widely and inspired many continuations. It is easy to imagine how a Persian translator or intermediary could have obtained a copy at a time when cultural goods traveled far with merchants, envoys, and scholars. The Mongol conquests dramatically altered the political map of Asia, yet they barely shifted prevailing Islamic assumptions about Europe. Some modern scholars have speculated that Rashid al-Din might have omitted information deliberately, fearing that too much detail would embarrass Muslim rulers who had converted to Islam but still sought alliances with non-believers. This explanation seems overly conspiratorial. Nothing prevented Rashid al-Din from recording the histories of India, China, or of polite relations between the Ilkhans and the Great Khan in East Asia, who was certainly not a Muslim. The real importance of his work lies in its solitary nature, and in the irony that even this unusually global historian viewed the Christian West through habits of disdain inherited from centuries of cultural separation. The idea of Europe as a backward and insignificant fringe of civilization was deeply rooted in the Islamic intellectual world, and only much later, particularly in the Ottoman era, did Muslim understanding of Europe begin to widen, though even then the exchange of curiosity was unequal. Western interest in the East always ran deeper than Eastern interest in the West. In reality, the Mongol campaigns opened Asia far more to European knowledge than to Asian knowledge of Europe. In the Middle East, religious views changed little, and the presence of Westerners in China as merchants, friars, or government servants made little impact on Chinese awareness. China remained intensely self-contained. Even within the Mongol Empire, the divide between Eastern and Western mental worlds stayed wide. Muslim scholars in Iran respected and learned eagerly from China, adopting techniques that transformed Persian miniature painting with Chinese motifs of rock, cloud, and tree. Yet the influence flowed in only one direction. Chinese art under the Yuan absorbed nothing Persian in return. Foreign craftsmen were valued not for their culture, but for skills that served practical ends. Europe, on the other hand, gained vast new information, even if it took centuries to recognize its value. Marco Polo's book, though doubted at first, shaped geographical imagination. Later medieval readers often preferred fantastical works full of marvels and monstrous races, yet even those tales hid fragments of accurate knowledge beneath exaggeration. Increasing trade during the 14th century demanded practical guides to routes and goods, and merchants compiled manuals that mapped the overland road to Cathay in confident terms, even when risk was greater than they admitted. Many travelers never wrote about their experiences, but what they reported by word of mouth helped expand Europe's mental horizon. When Columbus attempted to sail west, he believed sincerely that he was seeking the domain of the Khan, described by Polo. His personal copy of the book, preserved today, bears marks of use that show how strongly it shaped his calculations, even when those calculations were flawed. Learned opinion still doubted polo, yet the impulse toward exploration that eventually reshaped world history began partly with the information carried home from the Mongol centuries. Charles Melville's study on the uprising of the Amirs in 1319 forms part of a wider group of papers in which he reassesses the final decades of Ilkhanid Persia. These investigations were eventually brought together in a concise but densely argued monograph, where Melville contends that the Ilkhanate carried within it the causes of its own breakdown long before the death of Abu Sa'id, despite the surface appearance of prosperity under his rule. This interpretation stands in sharp contrast to earlier views, including my own initial assessment, which portrayed Abu Sa'id's reign as a period of stability that ended abruptly without a prolonged decline. Later chroniclers often described his era almost nostalgically as a time of balance and plenty. Melville, however, sees the underlying fractures, the accumulated tensions among the nobility, and the vulnerability of power once the dynasty lacked a strong successor. His work encourages a fresh reading of the Ilkhanate's last years as a slow unraveling rather than a sudden catastrophe, a process shaped by competing warlords and administrative weakness that had been developing well before the 1330s. The most influential works produced since then have focused not only on Iran, but also on the eastern heart of the empire. The regions ruled by the Great Khan after Kublai secured supremacy in the succession struggle of the 1260s have drawn more scholarly interest than at any previous time. Research on Yuan China, once a neglected field, has grown steadily. Major landmarks include Rossabi's extensive study of Kublai Khan, the substantial Yuan volume in the Cambridge History of China, and a collection of biographical studies gathered under the title In the Service of the Khan. One should also note the wide-ranging narrative of pre-modern China written by Frederick Motte, who devotes considerable space to the Mongol period and treats it as a fully integrated phase of Chinese history. Administrative history has been one of the areas transformed most noticeably. Elizabeth Endicott's examination of local government remains a key contribution, especially her analysis of the role of the Darugachi, an office that served as one of the Mongols' most important instruments of provincial control. Although she challenges some earlier suggestions about the origins of this post, her research has significantly expanded our understanding of how power operated outside the imperial court, where documentation is often thinnest. Even more monumental is the work of David Farquhar, who devoted many years to reconstructing the institutional framework of the Yuan state. His reference study, published after his death, painstakingly maps out the structure of government as it stood in the early 14th century, describing each post and bureau along with its function. The result is demanding to consult, yet invaluable for anyone wishing to understand how Mongol authority was exercised and how much of the imperial steppe tradition they preserved when ruling China. Farquhar emphasizes that the Yuan state resembled the wider empire in miniature, with a dominant imperial core in the north, surrounded by dependent yet semi-autonomous territories modeled closely upon it. While administrative and political history have advanced substantially, it is perhaps in the field of art and material culture that the most dramatic reassessment has taken place. Specialists in visual and decorative arts have long recognized the extraordinary inventiveness that characterized the 13th and 14th centuries across Asia. For decades, they have shown that Mongol patronage encouraged the movement of styles, craftsmen, and motifs from one cultural sphere to another at a scale that had scarcely been imagined previously. The pace of this work has not slowed. A major exhibition of Mongol period art, held in New York and Los Angeles at the beginning of the 21st century, brought together objects of astonishing technical refinement. Its catalog included essays by historians and art historians alike, among them some of the most authoritative voices working in the field. Their research demonstrates beyond doubt that Mongol patronage generated new artistic forms rather than merely destroying old ones, and that creativity flourished even during times of intense political turmoil. Walking through that exhibition, even on the page, makes it almost impossible to maintain the stereotype of the Mongol age as an era defined only by conquest and devastation. One final piece of recent research offers an unexpectedly modern perspective on Mongol influence. A genetic study released in 2003 proposed that a remarkable proportion of the world's male population, possibly around 1%, carry a Y chromosome lineage that can be traced back to Chinggis Khan or to one of his close paternal relatives. If the estimate is correct, then the legacy of the empire survives not only in literature, art, trade networks, and institutional memory, but literally in the bodies of millions of people alive today. It is a curious reversal of the traditional view. The conqueror most often remembered for destruction may ultimately be known for the scale of his biological descendants, rather than for the bloodshed that marked his campaigns. This genetic finding also encourages us to reconsider what is meant by legacy when speaking of the Mongol age. Influence is not only measured in chronicles, campaigns, or the rise and fall of dynasties. It can reside in the institutions of Eurasian governance, in the hybrid aesthetics of manuscripts and ceramics, in the spread of scientific instruments and botanical knowledge, and, as unexpected as it may seem, in the very DNA of entire populations. The study reminds us that the story of the Mongols cannot be reduced to siege engines and battlefields alone. Their movement across continents carried languages, technologies, religious ideas, textiles, medicinal plants, and human families. The world that emerged after them was not the same as the one they encountered. Trade routes widened, diplomatic horizons expanded, and different civilizations began to understand themselves in relation to one another more than ever before. It is tempting for modern readers to view the empire through extremes, either as a symbol of devastation or as a romantic engine of global connection. The truth, as always, lies in the difficult space between. The Mongols left scars on cities and landscapes, yet they also created arteries along which knowledge and art traveled at extraordinary speed. Their rule ignited violence and also patronized poets, scholars, calligraphers, and engineers. The empire's history is therefore not a single story, but dozens woven together. The administrative experiments in China, the political turbulence of Iran after Abu Sa'id, the flowering of miniature painting under Ilkhanid patronage, the cross-continental movement of craftsmen and merchants, and the silent survival of genetic descent across centuries. To reflect on all of this is to recognize that the Mongol world cannot be understood only through its beginning or its collapse. Its essence lies in the patterns it set in motion. Patterns of exchange, adaptation, cultural fusion, and migration that continued long after the imperial banners vanished. Today, the legacy of Chinggis Khan is visible less in fortresses or battlefields than in the subtle threads connecting Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The world remembers him as a conqueror, but history now invites us to remember something more. An empire that reshaped continents, altered demography, transformed artistic vision, and forced civilizations to reimagine the boundaries of the world itself. In the end, the Mongol Empire stands not simply as a memory of destruction, but as a vast turning point in global history. A moment when worlds met, collided, and intertwined so powerfully that their influence can still be felt, seen, studied, and even carried within the blood of millions.